They came in the year 1136. They came from far away, from Burgundy. After a difficult journey, a small group of Cistercians reached Kisselbach Valley in the Rheingau, the area on the right bank of the Rhine west of Mainz. They wanted to found a new monastery, their own monastery, in the ruins of an abandoned church. Eberbach Monastery, a place of tranquility where they could lead a devout life far away from civilization. The monks faced a life full of privation. They moved in almost 900 years ago. It was the start of the great history of a legendary monastery. Eberbach Monastery, a mystical place chosen by the monks in the Middle Ages. As if by miracle, the monastery has been preserved almost completely. There's no other place in Germany where visitors can see more authentically how monks in the Middle Ages lived and worked in Romanesque and early Gothic buildings from the 12th and 13th centuries. Nobody knows this place and its history better than Günther Ringsdorf. He was responsible for the monastery as its manager for more than 20 years. Ringsdorf, whose nickname is the last abbot of Eberbach, thinks it's incredible what the monks achieved in those days.
They built what you can see here with their own hands. They didn't need anyone else. They were alone. They built Eberbach Monastery just like all the Cistercian monasteries were built.
The Cistercians were unfaltering in their faith and radical in their principles. They rejected compulsory labor, refused compulsory levies and gifts. They wanted to be their own masters. Over time, they developed into the managers of the Middle Ages. This monastery was home to up to 120 monks and some 200 lay brothers. The most important rule of their order was ora et labora, pray and work.
The largest wine business in the known world at the time was built by the Cistercians in Eberbach. It must have been fascinating. In a radius of more than 350 kilometers, they had 205 farms where they grew grapes for wine as well as other things. They had their own ships, Baxter and Pint, in which they sent their produce down the Rhine to be sold in Cologne.
Eberbach lies in the Rheingau region on the right or north bank of the Rhine, where the river flows briefly from east to west. The nearest large town is Wiesbaden. The monks had their sought-after wine shipped down the Rhine too. An old crane is a reminder of that. God's servants understood their business. According to the principle of supply and demand, they achieved top prices for their top wines.
The Cistercians laid the foundation for the viticulture we have today because they had the knowledge and the skill to plant the most famous vineyard, the Steinberg vineyard, which is known all around the world.
It's incredible. Even hundreds of years ago, Steinberg was the monastery's best vineyard. The monks had brought the art of wine growing from Burgundy and were successful with it in the mellow Rheingau. Their successor in Eberbach is Dieter Greiner, the head of the Hessian State Wineries. Dieter Greiner has made the vineyard fit for the future, but today it's all about the technology of the past. An ancient press is to be activated again, even though it hasn't been in operation for decades. The old item is carefully taken apart. Will the press ever function again?
This is a dream come true for us today because we're allowed to make wine with the 17th century wine presses. These presses were used to make high-quality wines for centuries. We have wines in our cellar going back to 1706. They're still of excellent quality, and we want to unearth the secret of this quality with these presses.
But they can't quite do it the way they did in the Middle Ages. If they really want to produce wine from these grapes, they have to put a steel tub into the old press for reasons of hygiene. It's only when that's installed that they'll be ready for the grapes. But then they want to proceed in the same way the monks did hundreds of years ago. The Eberbach monks weren't just incredibly industrious, they were innovative too. They were constantly improving and refining their pressing techniques. They had intense discussions with their brethren in other Cistercian monasteries. That's the only way they were able to become true masters in the field, by deploying all available forces. The former manager, Günther Ringsdorf, experienced this a great deal in his monastery with its mysterious medieval cellars. But there's one day he'll never forget. It gave the monastery a whole new career.
A gentleman came up to me and asked if they could film in the monastery. I said, of course, as long as you don't set it on fire. They started laughing, spoke in Italian, Spanish, German, and I don't know what other languages. And then they asked whether I knew the book, The Name of the Rose. I had been given it for Christmas, but I hadn't read it.
Günther Ringsdorf trusted his instincts and opened up the monastery to the film crew. A perfect backdrop for filming Umberto Eco's bestseller. Sean Connery, unforgettable in the lead as a friar investigating mysterious murders. Even the producer, Bernd Eichinger, couldn't have known that his film would become such a box office hit. Here is some rare footage of the set. Eberbach Monastery was suddenly world famous. The film crew spent weeks in the monastery, and more than once Günther Ringsdorf had to put his foot down.
I was incredibly scared that they could damage the monastery somehow. Thankfully, I came here on Sunday morning, here into this room, and they wanted to put an iron band around this pillar. It was too small, so they wanted to use a hammer to make holes in the pillar. I shouted and told them to stop. They were damaging the monastery. I was so angry. I told them to film and get out.
Ready? Action!
Of course, Günther Ringsdorf didn't put an end to their filming. And so the old walls became film stars themselves. To this day, tourists come to see where Eco's monks lived or were killed. It takes vast amounts of money to maintain the monastery. Around 70 million euros have gone into a full refurbishment in recent years. That has to pay for itself. New sources of income need to be found. Miriam Esse is a wedding planner. Marriages in the monastery are her bread and butter. 175 couples per year tie the knot in Eberbach. Miriam Esse and her team are there to make special days run smoothly.
It's really important that we're there on the big day itself. The couples know us because we've been there for them all along. We know what was discussed and what the couple want. The most important thing is for the couple to be as relaxed as possible.
Back to the film, The Name of the Rose. The film used this room, the monks' former dormitory, as the scriptorium, the writing room. Sean Connery, alias the Franciscan friar William of Baskerville, was constantly drawn to this room, to the books. He suspected that the key to solving the mysterious murders had to be in the elaborately illuminated writings, when books become a deadly peril. A few props, like this desk, remain from those wild days of filming.
This desk is very significant to me because I often came to the scriptorium late in the evening and stood at this desk to look through the books and admire the gold leaf and the wonderful letters. I was transported to the deepest Middle Ages.
Ausgesehen hat in diesem tiefsten, dunklen Mittelalter.
Were the Middle Ages really so dark here? The everyday life of the Cistercians was anything but pleasant. Private conversations were forbidden. there was a strict rule of silence. Their diets were meager. Meat, fish, eggs, butter, and cheese weren't allowed. Breakfast was foregone entirely. Every now and then they were allowed to drink the wine they made. The rest of the time they drank water. Often there was just one meal a day, and that usually consisted of heavy, dark bread. And yet, the monasteries at the time were beacons of progress, knowledge, and art. The High Middle Ages in around 1200, the time of the Crusades. The population grew dramatically. The farmers struggled to feed this many people. But new production methods increased yields. The trades and commerce flourished. And yet, the majority of the population lived in abject poverty. The Middle Ages were dark for the poor. They were only bright for the flourishing religious orders and monasteries. The Cistercian order spread explosively across Europe between 12 and 1300. The Cistercians were the first centrally organized order there was. We know of more than 700 locations. Mostly it was the sons of wealthy aristocrats who were fascinated by the sparse, devout life of the monks. It was an honor for families to have a relative in a monastery. But life in a monastery was so full of privation that the life expectancy of the brethren was only around 30. For centuries, viticulture was the dominant industry of the monks in the Rheingau. They built an enormous 2.5-kilometer wall around their exclusive vines in Steinberg. It was to protect the precious grapes from intruders. But it had quite a different effect. Protected by the wall, a microclimate formed in which the grapes ripened particularly well. The monks lost their vineyards after the monastery was dissolved in 1803. Today, they're owned by the state of Hessen. The state wineries maintain Germany's largest vineyard, 220 hectares under the name Eberbach Monastery alone.
The grape harvest isn't very different